All right, welcome back to the afternoon security track for State of Open. I am genuinely very excited to have a panel which I personally requested to the best of my abilities, because I think there's some really interesting discussions to be had. Let's jump in. So to start, can each one of you just give me a very brief description of why you are on this stage today?
I'm going to start with Anjana.
Hi, I'm Anjana Rajan. I'm the Assistant National Cyber Director at the White House, at the Office of the National Cyber Director. I think one of the things that I'm really excited to be here today is that open source doesn't know borders, right? It's an international issue, and we need to start talking about international strategy from the ground up as we think about the solutions.
I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm General Manager for the Open Source Security Foundation, and I lead a consortium of organizations focused on trying to raise the default state of security across open source software and secure the software supply chain. I'm here really because we find ourselves in a lot of conversations with the White House, with other governments, trying to help them understand kind of how open source works and what's really the right way to raise the floor on through policies, through investment across open source software when it comes to security, and what are the wrong ways and how do we avoid some of those?
And I'm Sarah Novotny. I lead open source strategy for Microsoft. And I'm here because, one, we helped found the Open Source Security Foundation and are continuing to invest efforts there. But fundamentally because security is a worldwide software problem, and we as open source leaders can help move the industry forward by moving our practices toward default secure and a more collaborative manner of engagement, of course.
Excellent. And I am Sal. I'm a developer, and I'm here because getting security right will make my job easier. The first thing that I really wanted us to jump into was the idea of sustainability for open source projects. What is it that we're looking at as risks and concerns around sustainability of projects, and what does that look like as a security concern?
I have many ideas.
Go for it.
Okay. One of my favorite is that big companies, Microsoft included, will often hire maintainers, but then have them potentially spend not their primary amount of time on an open source project that they were actually hired for, or because of that skill, because of that engagement. So I think there's a lot of understanding about open source and security that needs to be shifted around in our many companies. Yeah.
Well, and to be clear, I think sustainability, since that's such a broad term, we're really focusing here on how does an open source project live to serve another day, live to serve another year, and frankly to serve the needs of its user community, to publish updates, whether it's new features or simply bug fixes. You'd be amazed the number of new bugs that are discovered in projects that have not had active development in years, and sometimes they just fall on deaf ears, right? Because it's the tree falls in a forest. Well, sometimes there's an awful lot of users, but actually not a lot of, if any, people contributing to these projects. And so sustainability really does come from how do you have a team of people of diverse backgrounds, diverse incentives, diverse motives, I think, actively maintaining and having a sense of obligation to the end user community, still in the framing of a gift, because open source software is a gift given by its maintainers, by its contributors to the wider audience. And so sustainability comes down to how do you recruit more people into that sense of maintainership, that sense of stewardship, into the development team, right? Recognizing there's lots of different ways to contribute to a project, not just code, but documentation and others. And historically in open source projects, a lot of that has come from companies recognizing collective self-interest, putting devs on a project because they might be just above it in terms of providing support. They might be way up here in that you're a search engine, but you know you have to help improve the operating system, right? But for all these reasons, how do you bring more of those kinds of stakeholders into an ecosystem and keep those fires burning?
And align incentives.
Yes, very much. Yep. A very big challenge.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said. Those of you who are following U.S. politics, you may remember that last night our president gave the State of the Union address, and in the speech he talks a lot about infrastructure. And when we talk about what it means to invest in infrastructure for the long haul, we understand that when it comes to roads and bridges or clean water, that if you don't maintain this over time, your bridges will collapse, your water will have lead in it. And one of the things he said last night was the historic passing of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was one of the largest infrastructure bills that have been passed since Eisenhower invested in the interstate highway system. And in that bill, open source software is specifically called out, which I think is really exciting to see.
Yeah.
And when we talk about what it means to maintain this, this has been talked about a lot at this conference, right? We talk about free software, and it's a bit of a misnomer because it's not free. There is labor that needs to go into it. There needs to be physical infrastructure investment. There needs to be a long-term strategy because our economy depends on it, our national security depends on it, our democracy depends on this infrastructure. And so just to echo, what my peers here have said is we need to start thinking about this as any other piece of infrastructure, that if we want our bridges to stay up and we want our water to be clean, we also need our software to be secure and safe and resilient.
This ends up being a shift for a lot of people. This free like a puppy, like free like sunshine to free like a puppy, and then to recognizing that we have all these dependencies in all of our software, and that this should be a part of cost of goods, even if it is only a social contract and not a legal contract at this point. Or maybe we have to move to a space where there is a responsibility of return, like some of the copyleft licenses exist with an expectation of return of code. So we really have to shift the mindset to this is something that goes into a product we are producing. It is a cost of goods.
Yeah, I think so. I want to be a little bit careful about the metaphor about highways, specifically because it's radically different. I don't want us we could not possibly centralize the support of open source in the way that we can centralize physical infrastructure, because it is decentralized by definition.
Mm-hmm.
Or perhaps another way to say it is, I don't know if I even have the legal right to go and fill a pothole.
Exactly. Exactly.
I might like to, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're in a really interesting space where we got a lot of attention on a problem that's going to require an incredibly new approach. And as we step towards that, what are we doing to fill the massive gap between the security jobs that we need to fill and those who are qualified to fill them?
Yeah, and I think just to plus one that, we're talking about a supply chain that is not linear, right? We're talking about an incredibly complex network, and I think you're 100% correct that we cannot just pluck solutions from decades ago into the 21st century, and I couldn't agree more. I think from a workforce perspective, people need to understand that cybersecurity is by design an interdisciplinary field. That we need engineers and cryptographers, but we also need people who understand other disciplines that are so critical for this to work and for people to feel bought into this. Yesterday I spoke about my time being a CTO and responding to Log4 Shell, and I don't think people realize that when cyber vulnerabilities happen, it affects everyday people. It's not just the cyber community as we kind of traditionally define it, or even how it's perceived. And so a lot of what we're working on at the Office of the National Cyber Director is what is the workforce strategy for this really important issue. And my colleague Camille spoke about this at the plenary yesterday, but we have kind of four pillars to our workforce strategy that we're starting to think about. And I think first and foremost is understanding what does the national workforce need to look like for the long haul. This includes private sector, the open source community, academia, research institutions, and yes, we also need to think about the federal government as well. And so when we think about what does it mean to build that talent pipeline and to build these skills over the course of this somewhat new industry, that becomes a really core priority for us. The second is then thinking about how do you get people into this ecosystem in the first place, and that's where the education and training conversation becomes so critical. We think a lot about what does it mean to not just work with the elite engineering institutions, but working with community colleges as well, non-traditional education systems, and post-secondary and secondary education from the jump to make sure that the next generation who are digitally native understand that cybersecurity is part of the technical ecosystem. And then the final piece is, we talk a lot about how do we make sure that we're not putting the burden on the individual or the small business or the mom and pop shop that does not have the resources to withstand a cyber attack from a nation state. But in spite of that, we still want to make sure that they see themselves as part of the solution. And so what does it mean to create a digital awareness strategy to make sure that everyone understands the role that they can play? And when you think about these 4 pillars, they actually are a flywheel that kind of build off of one another. And so when you think about how do you build a workforce strategy, it's more than just talking about jobs. It's about recognizing that, particularly in the open source community, it is a different model than a corporation. It is a different model than a centralized ecosystem, and you have to kind of think differently about what it means to build resilience for the long haul.
Yeah, and the reports are that there's hundreds of thousands of positions unfilled that call for people with certifications in cybersecurity, and so the one part of that is certainly how do you fill those kinds of jobs, but I really love the point that this is everybody's responsibility and parts of every role that play into that. So at the OpenSSF, one of the things we created was courseware. It was about 15 hours of content that anybody who's a developer at any level, frankly, should take, because it encapsulates here are the most common types of traps that developers fall into that become the source of vulnerabilities later. Things like not understanding how to sanitize user-contributed input before you do something dangerous with it. And it's a great set of things that aren't really taught in computer science courses. And regardless, most open source developers are not formally taught in computer science anyways. I mean, a lot of people in CS are self-taught, especially just to keep up with newer languages and the like. So that's one example. Another example is even going even more basic. We've published a set of concise guides for how to evaluate open source code and projects, and frankly all software, as to whether you can trust it. Like, does it exhibit certain things that we see about projects that do take security seriously, right? They have a published security team, right, that is reachable by an email address, right, to report a vulnerability against. Do they have test scripts, those kinds of things. And the flip side of that is another guide that we put out, which is how to make your project more secure. And here's like the really short guide to do that as well. Lots of this other kind of content that has been missing, frankly, out there that really tries to hit developers at all different levels, and again, try to up-level the state of understanding about how to build secure code amongst the open source community, or frankly, all developers.
There's another interesting aspect, all still in the education and sort of pushing this forward. And some of that is pattern matching, in the sense that we don't have a lot of good listings of best practices for a new open source project. So there's a working group inside the IEEE, which is also coming up with what does it mean to be a project? How do you set up best practices? What are the common patterns, which is going to become, we hope, some set of standards that we can then point to that say, this is what it means to be a secure project. Because I think sometimes secure project is conflated with has no bugs, which is not possible to confirm beyond, I don't know, the next 6 minutes, maybe, if Sal's not hacking at it. So I think there's also an understanding that responsibility becomes a shared responsibility. We talked a little bit about that, and it becomes a shared responsibility both as a consumer of open source, but you also need, with that understanding that there's a shared need there, you have to also understand that you have to contribute back to it, and you have to participate in all of these ways to make sure that you're, say, I don't know, using a curated open source inside your development, so that you have if you don't have the skills, you have some sort of support or cover from an organization that will help you there. Now, how do we bridge that gap? We do a lot of performative art in open source. We keep talking about security in open source. We keep showing what that means, because if you're self-taught and you don't have that, it's hard to match that pattern. And we have the education problem, which is security is not generally taught right now in CS.
Yeah, I just have one concern broadly as we start to encourage a whole generation of new cybersecurity researchers specifically, but the hardening of open source as well. I think it's excellent that we focus on educating the maintainer class, educating contributors, and we create as secure systems as we can. Yep. I also cannot walk off the stage without actually speaking to the underbelly of cybersecurity, because right now, there's probably, absolutely less than 1,000, but about 200 people who are very, very good at hacking. And the real difference between a white, gray, or a black hatter is typically I'm out there learning in real time, experiencing, trying to do a bug bash, do something like that. I become a black hatter not because I have bad intentions, but because I've raised a vulnerability. I want to disclose it to an open source package, and I'll get contacted, theoretically, by a nation state that strongly suggests that I don't. That is why, in my opinion, I would surmise that Log4j, Log4Shell was probably raised dozens of times, and it was only released several weeks after the Ukraine offense because it was no longer of use. We're going to encourage a generation of people to jump in, put your hands on the keyboard. We have to figure out how to protect that.
It has to be, you have to align incentives. And a nation state offering incentives for a 0-day is a really tough thing to compete with.
Yes.
So speaking specifically to Log4j and Log4Shell, there were people who had raised, Mark Curphey has an example of a tweet that he went out where he said, this stretch of this code I'm worried about because it doesn't look good. At a conference in 2017, he gave a talk about this, right? It's like a flag that I'm sure this was a bug that had been found by nation states or other actors and had been kept confidential. The one that actually got reported was discovered, interestingly enough, by an Alibaba researcher who was also an Apache Software Foundation member, or a member of the project at least. I'm not sure if a full member of the foundation, reported it through the appropriate structures.
Nice.
And they started to do a coordinated disclosure process, and then it leaked because of an inadvertent disclosure, and an inadvertent message during that. Because not a lot of devs know how to do, in fact, we published a guide for this to try to help them to do coordinated vulnerability disclosure, because it's kind of important to make sure you have the right patch. Maybe there's other bugs that might happen, and that was the case on Log4Shell, was that there are actually 4 different CVEs that rolled out over the course of 5 weeks that compounded the problem and compounded the patching problem. And frankly, this is a bug that could have been found for about an $80,000 or $100,000 source code audit by a third party, right? And one of the problems here, and this was something that was cited by the what was it, the Cyber Defense Review Board? Is that right? Cyber Safety Review Board, CSRB's report on Log4j that came out last July was, there wasn't simply the cash in the back pockets of either the Apache Software Foundation or any of the individual devs to pay for that 80 to 100K security audit, right? Think about like the return on investment. And we've been able to spend that, or buy it on the black market perhaps, but like at the very least, like do a third-party audit, have remediated that, and then avoided this kind of, it could only have been a multi-billion-dollar industry disruption over ruining countless people's holiday breaks, right? So, the fact that it was a Chinese researcher, I mean, Alibaba, who is kind of, dinged anyways with the Chinese government, they did get a lot of unwelcome kind of feedback from the government for not having told them first. But frankly, I think there was enough, inside of the open source community, there's a recognition that there is a role for government to help facilitate the right kinds of processes to happen, but that if it starts to become restrictive in the form of we've got to only notify the nation state who's the person who's the citizen of discovered it, or notify them first before telling anyone else, that's going to create advantages for one party, disadvantages for other, and disrupt a lot of what are otherwise some very delicate interests to keep balanced here. But that the long term, the game theory is everyone's security is better enhanced by working together as a global community to solve this in the technically the right way and the path that is the least disruptive for everybody.
Yeah, and I think we talk about what are the root causes of the security vulnerabilities in open source in particular, and the incentive structure for reporting a CV is highly misaligned.
Yeah,
right.
broken.
Why would you call the police when you bug in your own code? I don't think we've really understood like what the end game is for the broader ecosystem. And again, just to foot stomp what you just said around like a game theory problem that counterintuitively everyone wins when you have a secure and resilient internet. And I think that's really what, at least at the Office of the National Cyber Director, we talk so much about that resiliency is the end game, right? Building security benefits all of our national security interests, our economic interests. And yes, that means our adversaries might also have a secure and resilient internet, but you know what? That's actually the price we want to pay for our best interests. And I think that is a kind of a provocative shift in the conversation, and I think you're completely correct, that really understanding like what does it mean to be cyber secure, it is not a zero-sum game, and that we have to start thinking about this differently in the same way that we think about having just an ecosystem that is healthy and thriving.
Yeah, I think that leads us really well into the next question. So open source is democratic, distributed, chaotic. That's the part that I like. How are nation states specifically right now observing and recognizing their relationship to open source, both as consumers and as regulators separately?
You know, I think I said this yesterday. I'll speak for the U.S. government, of course, but I think it took Log4j for the U.S. government to start realizing that this was an ecosystem worth paying attention to. And people ask, is this a new conversation? I said, no. This forum, this conversation is not new in the engineering community. It's new in the fact that you're now talking about it at the policy level. I think one of the things that we are really thoughtful and intentional about how we frame open source is first by leading with the fact that this is a force multiplier for good. And if you lead with that conversation, you're going to think about policy very differently. And so first, when you ask yourself, like, why is this so important? I think someone mentioned it yesterday in the plenary, you cannot build a successful business if you're not using open source. Like, you will not be able to compete, period. You will not be able to defend against authoritarian regimes if you don't have open source. Like, those are the first principles we need to talk about. When you have that power, of course, then you can think about the security risks and national security implications. And so for us, I think how we're framing it at the Open Source Software Security Initiative that we're leading across the executive branch is recognizing that there is a very complex and nuanced thesis around this. And so as we're thinking about solutions, it cannot just be a threat that we're scared of, but an opportunity and an ecosystem that we must defend and must protect. And so I think that's kind of the core framing for us, first and foremost. For many emerging technologies and nascent technologies, as well as long-standing technologies, is how do we make sure that we have respect for the craft of engineering first, and then think about what it means to regulate and build policy around that second.
In 1999, the Supreme Court decided in Bernstein versus USA that cryptography, right, public key crypto, the ability to secure communications, was no longer to be considered a dual-use munition, or a dual-use technology that was classified as a munition and regulated by the State Department, at which point you were prevented from exporting, as a U.S. citizen, exporting any software that could do more than 40-bit encryption, or you could go up to 128 if you followed a bunch of rules. But obviously open source code has no limits to the key lengths of cryptography that you could use, because it's just a variable in code you could change, right? That act, before Bernstein passed, that fact kept us from being able to build secure protocols natively into the internet, right? It had to be bolted on after the fact as SSL and TLS, and up until 99, it was imported into the United States from Britain, from Australia, from other places where cryptographers in many cases left the US to go and do their work. And so Bernstein, that decision changed that. Then at the Apache web server, we could build it in directly, and it was a much better outcome. And so there's always been this not adversarial perhaps, but certainly a strained relationship between the tech sector and frankly the open source sector and government policy. Because I think even well-intentioned policies can sometimes end up changing those incentives in such a way that it can really throttle a lot of the dynamicism that you see inside of the open source community. And the current example of that is the proposed bill in the European Union, the Cyber Resiliency Act, which does some of the right things in terms of encouraging is put too soft, mandating the use of certain kinds of scans and process audits and tooling by open source software, especially that used in critical infrastructure. But instead of encouraging it and providing support and help and carrots, it's got the stick of a mandate of, you don't get to disclaim liability anymore as an open source developer when you put it out. And that is a pretty damaging thing. It could lead us to a similar situation we had before Bernstein in the States, but in the other direction, where open source projects decide not to export to the European Union, right? Or open source devs inside the EU decide they can't do their work safely without running the risk of losing their homes or being fined or things like that. So So there's a lot of hard work to do here, and I'm really encouraged by conversations that we've had, that even folks in the European Union and certainly here in Britain we have, about what are the right ways to apply that policy in constructive ways to move things forward. And I'll just end with, for me, one of the best examples of where collectively we took an internet ecosystem and up-leveled it to a more secure default was through the migration of the web from an entirely unencrypted platform where everything was going over the network in clear text to what is now, 98% encrypted traffic, HTTPS. And it was through a sequence of phases that I'd broadly call carrots, then changing the defaults, and then sticks, right? It was the green little key at the top of the browser bar that said you're on a secure website, congratulations. So for your banking stuff, you really want to look for that. To changing the defaults by getting Let's Encrypt out there and making it very easy for anybody when you're installing a web server to automatically get the key and rotate it every 90 days, that kind of thing. And then the stick part was when the browser makers finally said, no, we're going to put up a bunch of warning signs, maybe even entirely block you if you're trying to access websites that instead should be encrypted. So we need to think about the same things when it comes to adopting security practices and policies and that sort of thing. We can't just rush into mandates and put the burden upon even what seem like well-funded entities to be able to do this work. We've got to progressively work our way through it and learn as we go. Sorry for the long answer.
That's a great answer.
I think there's an interesting overlay to your answer, which is not answering your question, but is maybe making an ask, Anjana, to nations everywhere. You just happen to represent one. But one of the challenges as an organization working in open source, as an organization trying to comply with regulation, is with so many different regulations popping up, maybe being European Union this or the United States this, as we are going through this and learning, let's try really hard not to end up conflicting, because that's our biggest risk. Is what if the CRA gets passed in the EU, and then we in the US make some entirely different choices. Then it becomes much more difficult for us. So again, this is a global community, and this is absolutely not the moment, even for all of the crazy in the world that's happening today, for us to be nationalistic or trying to get an edge in one way or another as a nation around open source. It goes right back to we are better if our internet is secured, even if our adversary's internet is secured.
Couldn't agree more. And I think, I said this before, this open source software security initiative, I hope, is the beginning of a very long-term sustained effort, long after I leave the White House. And you'll notice that we talk about international engagement in the earliest months. It's a big reason why we're here at State of Open, for that reason. This is a internet native community. It is not a company that was found, created in the United States that is scaling globally. And so the approach to international harmonization around regulation has to be different. And so we need to be starting from day one thinking about what does an open source ecosystem look like around the world?
Yes.
And then build the concepts first and the thesis first, and then think about what does the regulation happen second. I think you mentioned something around the concept of what are the incentives for this? I think what I love about the open source community is that there is a deep shared values in our ethos around cybersecurity. And I think people forget that cybersecurity is not a stifler of innovation and economic growth. It is an enabler. We're seeing so many new companies and new cryptographic ideas come out because we're now recognizing the stakes are so high. And I think for us as the open source community, we can talk about this and say, this isn't a compliance checkbox. This is actually some of the most brilliant evolution of technology that we get to see because we care about this and we understand the stakes. And I think there's an opportunity for this community to lead on how we talk about technology more broadly, which I think is a call to action for all of you to say that it is not just up to government officials to talk about this. It's about engaging with the experts who are actually doing the building. And I think that's kind of one of our core principles, is making sure we're talking to the folks who actually know what they are building and doing first, and making sure the regulation is inspired and influenced by that.
Absolutely. I will just say one thing to that. Particularly in the UK, we need much more sort of education and people sitting in leadership that understand it. I've got a lot of conversations with regulators where they've got it's a box approach. They're like, at some point, all this, I can think of it as a box. What kind of stamp can I put on it and call that done? And that's just not appropriate because that's not how any of this works. And I always put it the same way. We wouldn't allow that kind of phobic behavior around the thing you're regulating in any other sector. It would not be appropriate for someone to regulate the automotive industry if they were afraid to drive cars. We need more people who are competent and technical enough to inform. That's why I'm really grateful that you're in the position you are. I think from that, I've got one final question that we could probably expand on forever.
Oh, yeah.
What are we going to do to make open source secure by 2030? And very specifically, the answer matters to me, because if the internet is not secure by 2030, I'm just going to unplug and go live on a boat.
Well, Sal, I think you've given us your retirement plan.
Yeah.
Because the internet won't be secure in 2030, just for the same reason that there will always be security holes yet to be found. Sorry, sad to say. My hope is that we can avoid something as damaging or as disruptive as Log4Shell was, as Heartbleed was before that, these kinds of major earthquakes that do a lot more damage than they need to, right? And from a risk-adjusted point of view, it's a tremendous drag on society. It's a major cost, and it's a discouragement to innovation as well, right? So, there are lots of things that we can do to bring down that risk. There is not one silver bullet there. There were a set of 10 things that we identified about a year ago in response actually to the Log4j breach, but also specifically the White House asking us, you all have some cute ideas there at the OpenSSF, but what does it actually take to close some of these things that you found? And so we developed something called the mobilization plan, which was a set of 10 true north kinds of things that we could do across investments in third-party code reviews, in adopting digital signatures, in better education. We tried to map them out and say, what are some useful goals that are actually short-term goals that are achievable in 2 years, that have kind of a minimum viable approach to what would it take to just make a double-digit % in the problems that they identify. Frank, and you were part of that process in writing the document. Our community kind of scrambled for 2 weeks. It was like cramming for a final or writing your PhD thesis in the last 2 weeks of your PhD career. Anyways, it was, and we thought it would be billions of dollars. Like this would be, there's a lot of big problems there. It turned out that it called for $150 million over 2 years, right? If you added up all those. Now we started the clock on some of those projects. Others are still kind of in flight, and we're trying to figure out how best to support them. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, is my point. A lot of things where, just like with the example with Log4j, no one had that 80K in their back pocket to be able to spend on a third-party code review, and frankly, you should do it every year or 2 or 3. But if you could organize enough to identify what are the 200 most critical projects to do this year, 200 times $100,000 is $20 million, which starts to sound a lot more tractable. Things like setting up a emergency response team for open source projects, so that when a under-resourced team who knows that they're widely used, who knows that they could use some help in coordinating or even just figuring out, is this really a bug as bad as we think it is, and need that help in a confidential way, a staffed help desk to be able to go and help them do that. That takes real resources, right? That's unavoidably, right? But adding them together is not at the scale of the positive impact we could have, is not out of the question. And so that's what we put this plan together for, and has led us in terms of how should we organize our internal efforts at the OpenSSF, continue to really drive the volunteerism and the collaboration amongst the community that has led to the kind of leverage we get. But when we're going to go out there and start asking for money for some of these things, so we make sure the plan is extremely well vetted and has some very short-term kind of goals, and then frankly revise it each year, perhaps even every half year, as we go and learn and find new low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, and this mobilization plan, a lot of that's just it's open meetings, GitHub. That's how I'm participating. If you've got opinions, go submit a PR. You might not necessarily get accepted, but if it's a good idea, yeah, then you've engaged, you've contributed to open source. And we particularly need people from different backgrounds coming in at this time and providing additional support, because we got a bunch of like cybersecurity people that are like, we know how to do our job, but the sort of support around those processes is interesting. And I also have to appreciate that the mobilization plan just really cleaned up the slack. Now everyone's organized and like, I know exactly where to go to have my conversation, so thank you.
I appreciate that, thanks.
I'd like to sort of, within that, OSSF and Alpha Omega, because I actually find what Alpha Omega is working towards really interesting and valuable, because every time I see Jonathan Leach, I say, if you do your job just a little bit better, then I don't have to have a job. Because in some ways, what we're focusing our efforts around right now are training, education, mobilization, making sure that we handle the status of toil right now, of developer effort that's being really wasted on really unproductive repeat cases. But Jonathan's going through and finding vulnerabilities at a class level and trying to report and remove those. And it's those sort of like incredibly effective moments of using this technology to remove the end. What am I? So, okay, here's what I'm trying to say. We've all been doing cybersecurity like as individuals, in corporations, maybe reaching out, patching, working with open source, but there's also another side of here of just like do this intelligently, do this using computation, and I love that approach.
But it's still fraud. So there was 2 weeks ago, there was a press release put out by a company called Trellix, who, using a bunch of automated tools, went and scanned a couple million repositories on GitHub that are in Python, and found 61,000 projects that made unsafe use of an old Python library, tarball or tarfile library, I think it was called. And this was a bug actually in tarfile from one point of view. They refused to fix it because they said it would break POSIX. We don't have to go there. The problem was 61,000 projects used this thing incorrectly, didn't sanitize inputs before calling into it. And Trellix had written a script to go and find those systematically, which is kind of hard, parsing and understanding. It's not trivial. It's not just a grep, right? And then proactively, this is the really hard part, came up with pull requests that would fix that insecure usage, that would just add the sanitize call to it, right? Submitted those as pull requests back upstream and sat there and waited. And after 3 weeks, how many of those 61,000 projects do you think actually clicked the button to accept the pull request that was like a 2-line pull request to make their project no longer vulnerable to a 2007, that's the part I forgot to say. This bug has been a known CVE since 2007. How many of them do you think accepted that pull request? Okay, 1,000. I'll save it.
Thank you for saving.
Yeah. So 1,000 out of 61,000. Now, admittedly, a lot of those 61,000 were weekend hacks. There were people who had done like a one-off fork to play with it. So there's this very long tail, and a hard question to ask is, where do you cut off the tail? Like, how many projects do you actually care about? And it's going to be more than 10,000. It's going to be less than 10 million. But this is securing open source, securing the cyberspace, securing the internet infrastructure. There is that long tail, and you have to ask how many of those matter. And then of those that matter, I would wager 3,000 of those probably should have like closed that bug, should have had a maintainer community to do that, to really help make sure that it was a 99th percentile of users that would no longer be affected by that CVE. But we have to think about those kinds of scale. And that's a little bit what one part of the OpenSSF, something called Project Alpha Omega, is setting up a major scanning infrastructure to do like what Trellix did, scan these things, report them at scale. Jonathan Leach, a researcher we just hired, has been doing this. He gave a DEF CON talk in 2022 about how to do this, has 6 campaigns underway now, but we will be lucky if we get 10%, close up, because after that, what do we do? Do we go visit them at their homes and tell them to accept the pull request? I think we know that that's the major part of the challenge at the end of the day, is getting people to care enough about this.
Oh no, you can do that. You go and you find them on Slack. I call it security shaming.
But I think this is what I think it's exciting. I think we're talking about mobilizing against a generational defining crisis, right? This is why I make the comparison to infrastructure, is not that the solutions are the same, but the urgency is the same. Yep. We're now, I think, getting people to care about this at the highest of levels, which I think is a huge win for this community. But now I think there's a chance, again, for the innovators to now lead us to phase 2. A CTO is being asked to say, hey, I need to tell you what's in my software supply chain. This should be table stakes. I should not have to manually create a bill of materials. I should be able to rely on my GitHub repository to click a button and update that every time I submit a pull request. I should be able to integrate a CVE list from MITRE to say, is there a vulnerability in this supply chain? And GitHub should block anything being pushed to production if that hasn't been met. We should not be relying on manual effort to get the other 60,000 repositories to not get updated. So this is, again, call to industry, call to the community. This is where the technical innovation and the product innovation, I think, is the next phase for all of us to say, okay, now that we agree about the policy and the concepts, how do we now automate this? How do we now make this the cybersecurity by design? I think I just want to go back to your last question around like, what do we need to do by 2030? And I think this is a perfect question to ask because it reminds us like this is not a short-term solve. This is a long-term vision that we need to lead on. I think, Brian and I have talked about this before. There is no silver bullet. These are complex systems problems. If it were that simple, we would not be sitting here having this conversation. And I think we talked about there's like a handful of 10, 12 like key recommendations that can happen. And I liked your framing. It's like, how do we play chess, not checkers? Like we can spend all of our time playing whack-a-mole and trying to patch every single thing, or we can think about what are the solutions that actually get us ahead of the threat. And one of the many solutions that I think have come up from the open source community that have influenced us at the White House is one that I spoke about yesterday, which is the adoption of memory-safe programming languages. Mm-hmm. If we can start talking about like how do we recognize that we're making our lives harder by just creating more surface area for risk, we don't then spend our time on the hard vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. And to me, this is I wouldn't call it a low-hanging fruit because nothing about this is easy, but we will never outrun vulnerabilities. We will never be fully secure, right? Software is a living organism that requires nurturing and constant attention. So we need to be really thoughtful about where are we putting our top cybersecurity researchers' attention. I don't want to spend their time patching memory-safe bugs because that could have been prevented from day one. Mm-hmm. And so I think like we will always need to have those cybersecurity researchers focusing on the hardest part of the problem, and we're wasting that talent on patching bugs that could have been done from the beginning. And so our call to action, including folks at Microsoft, so I'm going to ask you for a favor, and you go back home as well, is we need to start asking the biggest infrastructure players to make that shift today, because it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of leadership and courage to shift these big institutions that have been building software that powers the global ecosystem, but are building on memory unsafe languages. And I think this is the one thing that is so exciting to us, because this is where every top cybersecurity policymaker and every top engineer agree on this. Mm-hmm. And we should not waste this moment, and we should take advantage of the fact that we've got good engineering practices informing good policy and mobilize against a common call to action.
It's interesting you bring up memory-safe languages. That's where I was headed. For me, and in fact, one of my team members is actually just kicking off the memory-safe language working group this week at the OpenSSF. And so we are very much investing in memory safety, in looking at where we can mitigate things, because there are hundreds of thousands of millions upon billions of lines of code in C and C++. And that is going to be a very long fix. That's a long haul, even if you want to.
Well, and I don't think the objective should be eliminate all use of memory unsafe languages, because there's still a lot of COBOL out there. And I don't think COBOL is memory safe. Maybe it is. But no, but it's going to take... But instead, what you could do is focus on what are like the really critical pieces. So, for example, the group, the same office that put together Let's Encrypt, has put together a proposal to go and fund memory-safe replacements for NTPD. Does anyone know what NTPD does? It does this little thing, which is keep time synchronized across the internet down to millisecond, microsecond levels. It's something that if it were attacked, we would have a hard time rebooting from that. Likewise, DNS infrastructure. We all take it for granted. Bind is written in C. Bind has been updated and but also attacked quite often in the history of the internet. So I think there's a couple of critical places. Yep. You could prioritize work. The Linux Linux kernel.
So another one they're working on,
TLS.
TLS.
Oh, I'm sorry, Russell's, which is mostly there, but really to be a drop-in replacement for OpenSSL is still a lot of work to do there. And it's not just writing the code. This is the other important thing. To get these projects to get that flywheel going, you need to invest in building the stakeholdership around it, building the DevRel, making it so that there's this user community that can become contributors communities, all the kind of stuff that we know makes for well-run open source projects. Even the Linux kernel now, by the way, allows for modules written in Rust. And I suspect that's the nice thing about Rust is you can kind of replace things piecemeal and go in and write replacements for the more critical pieces, even of a large software project. So I think there's a lot to be said for that initiative, and it's important to solve some of these systematic issues at scale. It is also one of those 10, 20-year kinds of projects.
And can we actually go deep on this OpenSSL piece? 'Cause I think this is where complex systems thinking is actually beyond just engineering.
They tap the water.
When you think about OpenSSL, and again, this is why the open source community should lead on this, they should be leading on this and saying we need to rewrite this in languages that are not introducing vulnerabilities. And that's a big ask, but that's a bold ask that we need to hold our own community accountable for. And then we look at the alternatives like Russell, libsodium, all these other TLS providers. How do we help them become players that can actually support government critical infrastructure as well? And so I think there's a push and pull that the open source community can call upon. One is asking the government to say, how do we make the process to become government approved infrastructure easier, more inclusive, less intimidating? But also, I think as the open source community who are talking about security, we need to lead. We need to be on the forefront of this, and when we're not, it makes it very hard to then argue that we are something that should be powering the broader ecosystem. So I think it's a shared accountability that at least certainly we are thinking about those push and pulls, but I think that's, again, a call to action for this community is what does it take to be seen as thought leaders on all fronts.
Absolutely. Well, I believe we are at time, and I think that's an excellent place to stop for the moment, but I think this is a conversation that we're going to be having till 2030.
At least.
Then we'll get you on your boat.
Thank you so much.
Good stuff.